Hello, good afternoon. The task of a person who is going to be introducing a speaker is, as I understand, is basically to talk about his work, his titles, his books, and I hope I will be able to do that at one point. But before going into that, I would like to take this opportunity to say something that I never said to Dr. David Moody, to David, and I try to say it very briefly. When I came to the United States, I came to the Oak Grove School 40 years ago. I was a young man. And the school was directed by two extraordinary persons, two great teachers. One of them was David Moody and Mark Lee. And I immediately felt very, very welcome, and not an easy task for me, even though I was welcome. Talking specifically about David Moody, I was always challenged by his intelligence, his rigor, his demand for excellency, and the fact that he never patronized on me. He never saw me like he should be talking down to me because my English was even worse than what is now. But he always talked to me like an equal. He was treating me like everybody else. First, I started as a volunteer. I did all kinds of things. I destroyed two trees. I tried to, yes, and one of them was planted by Krishnamurti. And I didn't water properly. I didn't know anything about gardening, so yeah, I feel very responsible for that. I helped in the kitchen, and eventually I was hired. And David Moody was my boss. And again, he always treated me like an equal. First, I didn't understand because I was expecting him to be more easy on me, and he wasn't. And for now, I appreciate, and I thank you for that. David Moody was a role model for me. Eventually, I got into education, and he represented the highest form of teaching. And by thanking him from the bottom of my heart, I'm thanking all the teachers, all the wonderful teachers that I met, all the wonderful teachers that work here, the wonderful teacher that is my wife, and say what Krishnamurti, or repeat what Krishnamurti said, that I really feel education is of the highest importance and is the most important profession. So David, I want to say that, and that was it. I don't know what else I can say to really thank you and to tell you what I never told you before. When I told you after Krishnamurti died that I was quitting the school, you called me to your office and you said that you encouraged me to continue with education and to be reading Krishnamurti. And I was arrogant enough as to try to teach you something. And I said, oh, don't worry, I know exactly what Krishnamurti said, and I'm ready to leave. And he just smiled and said, well, good luck and farewell. And I don't think I have ever talked to you again. So this is an opportunity to thank you. Thank you from my heart. Okay, now my task. Okay, David Moody was the first teacher hired by the Oak Grove School, I guess by Krishnamurti himself. He, together with Mark Lee, were the directors. Mark Lee, I believe, was the administrative director, and David was the teaching and education director. Is that correct?
Eventually.
Yeah. I should say something else. Sorry to make it so personal. I was lucky enough to participate in many dialogues or groups, meetings with Krishnamurti. Of course, I didn't open my mouth, but I was listening to all these wonderful teachers, and one of them, David, and I was very impressed by the way you push and not let being burned by the lighting that Krishnamurti was. You push, you have the courage, and I thought, well, I will never be able to really stand the question of Krishnamurti, but you did. You endured that, and in doing that, it was very revealing because we saw you were working, you were exploring in front of Krishnamurti. You have never been an interpreter. You have never been somebody who explains Krishnamurti. You have been somebody, through your books, through your conversations with Krishnamurti, somebody that pushed the questioning, which was your questioning and my questioning, and many of us questioning. And for that, I also feel very grateful. Well, probably you all know that David has been very much involved in talks related to education, to science, to the work of David Bohm, to the Bohmian dialogues. He was very active. And, he has a PhD from UCLA on education. And he has, as far as I know, 3 books. I think it was 4 books, right? 4 books. Three books, okay. I have to confess that I have only read 2. I haven't read Krishnamurti in America, but the Uncommon Collaboration, David Bohm and Jiva Krishnamurti, was very revealing, very, very illuminating, and of course the Unconditional Mind of Jiva Krishnamurti and the Oak Grove School. What else can I say? We are ready to listen to you and to learn from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Francisco. That was very kind of you. I was not expecting that at all. You brought me back many years. I should just correct one point. The initial hiring of me was done entirely by Mark Lee. Krishnamurti didn't have anything to do with it. It took him quite a while to warm up to me. So I have only Mark Lee to thank for my initial getting involved here. So before we get started, I'd like to say a couple of things. I'm going to be speaking about Krishnamurti's methodology, and I'll explain what I mean by that. But I would like to thank the Krishnamurti Foundation, or I don't know who exactly is responsible, YOP or some committee, or the trustees, YOP, for allowing me to speak on this topic, because I know methodology, it sounds kind of dry and academic. What happened was 2 or 3 months ago, somebody from the KFA, the Krishnamurti Foundation, sent me an email, somebody I don't know, and said, well, do you have anything you'd like to talk about at the gathering this year? So a couple days later, wrote back and I said, well, I could talk about Krishnamurti's methodology, and I explained a little bit what I meant by that. And I was a little bit apprehensive, thinking, well, the foundation might think, that's kind of boring, and they might, rather have a topic which is, which sounds more appealing, sort of more sexy and entertaining. so I wasn't sure if they would accept this topic, but they did. And so I just want to express my appreciation for having the confidence to let me proceed with this. Another point I wanted to mention before we start is I'm going to be talking very directly about Krishnamurti's teachings. And when I do that, I use the terms his teachings, his philosophy, his work. I use those terms interchangeably as synonymous with one another. So if I switch from one word to the other, it does not have any particular implications. I know that some people are a little bit sensitive about using the word philosophy in connection with Krishnamurti, but I don't mean anything special by it. I just use that term in kind of a loose, general sense. And one other thing before we get started, I wanted to mention that some of the material in my talk is contained in my book, Krishnamurti in America. That book came out 2 years ago, and that book is mainly about Krishnamurti's life, with special attention to his life in the United States, because that's the part that other biographers have kind of left out. But the book also goes into quite a bit about the teachings, and including some of the material that I'll be talking about today, as well as a number of other issues having to do with the teachings. So if that interests you, I think the book is available through the Krishnamurti Foundation, or you can get it on, Amazon. So I'd like to begin by pointing out what seems to me one of the most outstanding characteristics of Krishnamurti's teachings, and that is his work is very, very original. It's highly original in its overall scope and content, as well as in a great many of the more detailed observations. And as a result, his work cannot really be categorized as belonging to any pre-existing tradition or academic discipline or religion or any other school of thought. I was thinking about this just before I came over here today, and I was reminded of the famous verse from Ecclesiastes. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And it goes on, the thing that hath been, it is that which shall be. And that which is done is that which shall be done. And there is no new thing under the sun. And I thought of that in connection with Krishnamurti because I submit that his teaching is something new under the sun. It's something highly original, and I think it's good to bear that in mind if you want to understand him, to approach it with that frame of mind. It's not going to coincide fundamentally with anything that you've read about or learned about before. And I feel like what makes this high degree of originality even more remarkable is that the teachings are at the same time entirely factual. So his originality is not achieved by means of some vivid imagination or exciting new theories or some captivating speculation, but instead, from start to finish, he's entirely factual and only concerned with describing the actual contours of consciousness and human relationship. So great originality combined with strict adherence to factual realities represents one of the hallmarks of Krishnamurti's work. And one of the features of his originality lies in the rejection of any kind of method for purposes of self-understanding or meditation or psychological transformation. And his rejection of method was not simply a casual or incidental feature of his philosophy. It was something carefully considered and central, integral to the whole meaning and structure of his work. So we can't really understand the substance, the content of his teachings, unless we also understand what he had to say about methods and why he felt that any method is counterproductive and actively interferes with understanding oneself. On the other hand, Krishnamurti did recommend a certain approach, certain activities or processes that he felt were conducive to learning about oneself. So in this talk, we'll explore the nature of these activities and see how to distinguish them from any kind of method or systematic practice. And this whole set of principles and observations is what I'm going to refer to as Krishnamurti's methodology. And we'll try to see how this methodology fits in the context of other forms of inquiry. So, in order to understand Krishnamurti's methodology, I think we should begin from the broadest perspective and look at the most basic overarching principles of his approach. And one of these we've already mentioned, and that is his insistence on only dealing with facts. Now, there's nothing terribly original about wanting to stick with facts, except perhaps for the complete rejection of anything other than facts. So Krishnamurti has no patience with or interest in theories. It has nothing to do with any form of speculation. In fact, he even goes so far as to reject ideals of any kind. He considers ideals to be fictitious and ineffective and really just a way to avoid dealing with facts. So strict adherence to facts as opposed to theories or speculation or even ideals is one of the pillars of Krishnamurti's methodology. Another pillar is the complete rejection of authority in the psychological field. The word authority is related to the word author. So authority means accepting the truth of a statement based upon who said it, which is the author of the statement. And accepting anyone as an authority in psychological matters is really the denial of understanding something for yourself, seeing the truth of something for yourself. So remaining with facts and rejecting psychological authority are two of the pillars of Krishnamurti's approach. And a third pillar is to look at things objectively without letting your personal preferences influence your observations. So he says you cannot see clearly if you allow your likes and dislikes to enter into what you're seeing. So there's much more to be said about Krishnamurti's methodology, but I'd kind of like to pause here and point out that everything we've said so far is very consistent with the manner in which science proceeds. The science, too, is very concerned with what is factual, right? In scientific circles, that's called being empirical. And also in science, nothing is accepted on the basis of anyone's authority. Even if Einstein says something is true, it's not accepted, even by Einstein himself, unless facts and empirical observations can confirm it. And also, allowing your personal preferences to enter into and shape your investigations is considered completely impermissible in science. So in these respects, Krishnamurti's approach is very consistent with the way science proceeds. And I think we should also point out that these pillars of his methodology, they all correspond with what he calls the negative approach, or negative thinking. Krishnamurti says, don't be afraid of that word negative. what he means by it is negating that which is false. He says negating what is false is the most positive action. So he says negate authority in the domain of self-understanding. Negate personal preference or all of likes and dislikes when it comes to clear observation. And giving attention only to facts means negating theories and speculation and even ideals. So with this in mind, I think we can try to dig more deeply and address one of the most central issues in Krishnamurti's methodology, and that is, as we said at the beginning, he negates any form of method or system of practice in the psychological field. When I say he negates it, I mean he discards it, he puts it aside because it's false. And I think in order to understand his whole philosophy, we need to not only know the fact that he rejects methods, but also understand why. And I think the rejection of methods in Krishnamurti's teaching is possibly most conspicuous when it comes to the issue of meditation, because he considers meditation to be very important, but any form of systematic practice or technique he feels is false and contrary to the spirit of true meditation. And at times, Krishnamurti is kind of scathing when he makes this point. I read in one of his talks where he referred to transcendental meditation as transcendental nonsense. And, when it comes to the repetition of a specialized, individualized mantra for which people sometimes pay hundreds of dollars, he says people might just as well repeat Coca-Cola over and over in their minds. So he considers any kind of highly repetitive practice of that kind only dulls the mind and has nothing to do with true meditation. But Krishnamurti's rejection of methods goes way beyond techniques for the practice of meditation. He rejects methods in the entire field of inquiry or investigation into consciousness or understanding one's own state of mind. So now I think we can try to look at the essence of his objection to methods in the psychological field. And I'd like to begin by looking at the basic nature of all methods, at their intrinsic characteristics. First of all, any method contains or includes a goal or objective. It has no meaning without a goal to be achieved. And in addition, a method is a process in time. It's a technique for moving us from where we are now to some other place in the future. And if you talk about the future, you're bringing in a process that occurs through time. And finally, any method is basically mechanical in nature. And by mechanical, I mean that it follows a preconceived blueprint for action, and the blueprint can be repeated if necessary over and over again. So, as it turns out, each one of these characteristics, the goal or objective, the process in time, the mechanical nature of action, each one of these, according to Krishnamurti, is completely contrary and counterproductive to the valid, meaningful understanding of oneself. So let's find out why and try to look at each one of these characteristics in turn. If I have a psychological goal or objective that I want to achieve, it means that I'm dissatisfied in some way with what I am now. I have some concept in mind of something more or better that I want to become. And so right from the beginning, there's a division in my consciousness between what I am and what I think I should be or become. Now that division in consciousness is itself one of the most crucial things that Krishnamurti's whole philosophy is designed to end or resolve. He considers psychological division of any kind to be dysfunctional because it always leads to conflict. According to Krishnamurti, where there is division, there must be conflict. He calls that a law, and it's so basic to his teaching that I've sometimes called it Krishnamurti's law. Where there is division, there must be conflict. So any form of method in the psychological field implicitly, intrinsically creates a division, which makes us be engaged in conflict. Now, the second problem with methods, as we said, is that a method always involves time. It's designed to cover some distance from the present to something to be achieved in the future. And that gap entails a process that occurs through time. And as it happens, this brings us to yet another very fundamental issue in the teachings. Because Krishnamurti maintains there are two very different kinds of time. One is what he calls chronological time, and that's the ordinary kind of time that we're all familiar with. That's the thing that we measure with a clock or a calendar, and Krishnamurti has no problem with it. He considers that to be an obvious fact of daily life. But he says there's another kind of time altogether, and he calls that psychological time. So the distinction that he's making works like this. He says, time is a measure of movement. So chronological time is the way we measure movement in the outward, physical world, whereas psychological time is the way we measure movement in the inward, psychological world. It represents the distance from what I am to what I would like to be or become. And according to Krishnamurti, that kind of time is entirely illusory. He says it does not correspond to anything actual. It's just an invention of thought, he says, and does not really measure anything that actually exists. Now, this is kind of a subtle point because we don't always recognize or acknowledge these two different kinds of time. But Krishnamurti says that it's crucial to understand this. He says, time is the enemy of man. And by that he means psychological time. As I said, he has no problem with chronological time. But he maintains that psychological time has an entirely different quality. He says it's illusory, and the fact that we live in that illusion is one of our most basic, fundamental difficulties. So Krishnamurti objects to methods in the psychological field, first because they create a division and therefore conflict between what is and what should be, and secondly because they engage us or involve us in psychological time, which is illusory. Now, the third thing about any method is that it is mechanical. That means it's a preconceived blueprint for action, which is intended to be followed step by step and repeated if necessary. And according to Krishnamurti, any mechanical action can only produce a mechanical result. Or to put it a little bit differently, mechanical actions operate in terms of cause and effect. Now, Krishnamurti acknowledges that there is such a thing as cause and effect in the psychological field. For example, he says, fear has a cause. And if you can understand the cause, you can eliminate the effect. But he says there's other areas of the psychological field that don't operate in terms of cause and effect. In particular, he says, to truly understand something is not the result of any cause. He says insight and intelligence are functions of the mind that don't operate in terms of cause and effect. And above all, perhaps, he says love has no cause. So he would acknowledge that a mechanical procedure can bring about a limited localized, superficial effect in the mind, but it cannot bring about something much more fundamental, such as insight or intelligence or love, because these are not the result of any cause. So these are the reasons why Krishnamurti maintains that there is not, and there never will be, any method sufficient to bring about a fundamental change in human consciousness. So just to be clear, nothing we have said applies to the use of methods in the external physical world. If we want to bring about some kind of change in the physical world, it's totally appropriate to have an objective in mind, something we want to achieve in the future, and to have a mechanical procedure to bring that about. So we plant seeds in the spring in order to harvest in the fall, and there's clearly nothing wrong with that. But then we attempt to transplant that same kind of methodology into the psychological field, and there it doesn't work the same way. There, it's futile at best and often becomes highly dysfunctional, which is what Krishnamurti has gone to great lengths to point out. So now I'd like to switch gears and look at this from another angle. We've seen that Krishnamurti rejects methods, and we've seen why. So then what does he recommend? He's calling for change, and he says methods cannot bring about the kind of change that we require. So then what are we to do? Just give up and say nothing can be done? Or does there still exist in Krishnamurti's methodology something that we can do to facilitate or precipitate or discover psychological transformation? And in order to understand what we might think of as the more positive or constructive aspects of Krishnamurti's methodology, I think it's helpful to look at this in another context. Because we've shown that the whole question of using methods in Krishnamurti's teaching is, shall we say, problematical or challenging. And I think it might help to understand that the conventional field of psychology also has a great deal of difficulty with methodology. And I think if we can understand that, it will help us understand the genius, really, the very original and insightful way that Krishnamurti approaches this issue. So when I refer to the conventional field of psychology, I'm talking mainly about how psychology is studied as an academic discipline in serious research and professional journals. And in order to understand conventional psychology, we have to bear in mind that the discipline aspires to be regarded as scientific, as a form of science. But psychology labors under the burden of being considered what is called a soft science, like sociology or anthropology, instead of a hard science like physics or chemistry. So the hard sciences are the model that the soft sciences aspire to become. Like physics or chemistry, psychology aspires to produce hard knowledge, highly reliable facts and theories, thoroughly tested and statistically validated. But there's a fundamental problem with trying to turn psychology into a hard science. Because in physics or chemistry, if we perform an experiment and publish our results, it's not enough for the field simply to accept our results. Instead, somebody else in the field has got to repeat, or what they say, replicate our experiment and see if they come up with the same findings. This is considered a basic important principle in scientific procedure. And that standard or expectation to obtain results that can be repeated by others that represents a high bar and a challenge, even for the hard sciences. But it's much more challenging in the hard sciences, like psychology, that study human beings, because what's being studied in psychology are inward events or phenomena, like thoughts and emotions and memory and motivation. So it becomes very, very difficult to create the conditions for experiments where one team of researchers can get the same results as another. So in the very early years of the discipline of psychology, these issues had really not yet come into prominence. I think William James is considered the father of the field of psychology, at least in the United States. And his approach relied in part on the process of introspection. That means he considered it perfectly legitimate to examine his own states of mind, his own mental processes, in order to come up with evidence for the principles that he described. But within a few decades, the process of introspection as a means of obtaining reliable knowledge kind of fell into disrepute. It was considered unscientific because what I observe in myself can never be observed by anyone else. And therefore, it's impossible for another researcher to replicate my findings. And without replication, the whole model of becoming scientific just goes completely out the window. So this is considered a crucial issue because with introspection, I might fall into self-deception, or my observations might be biased by my personal preferences. After all, it is myself that I'm looking at, so I'm not at all disinterested in my observations. I have every reason or motive to discover only what I wish to be true, or whatever makes me appear in the most positive or favorable light. And so as a result of this dilemma, the discipline of psychology went to the opposite extreme from introspection. The field went so far that it stopped even trying to study anything that could be called mind or mental processes. Instead, the field declared that it simply represented the study of behavior, because behavior was something that could be observed independently, objectively, by different investigators. So this approach to psychology was called behaviorism, and it became very influential throughout much or most of the 20th century. So we've already seen that Krishnamurti's methodology has a lot in common with scientific procedures. His approach is committed to facts, not theories or speculation. He has no use for authority or accepting something just because somebody important said it was true. And his approach is committed to objectivity, not letting personal preferences influence your observations. But at the same time, his methodology calls for something that looks very much like introspection. Because he says, fundamental change, psychological transformation, is a matter of understanding yourself, and understanding yourself requires that you give close and careful attention to your own thoughts and feelings and motivations. So we kind of have to ask, is Krishnamurti fooling himself by adopting this methodology? Because conventional psychology has said this doesn't work. The discipline of psychology has said we've tried this, and we've seen that any inward observation can never be objective. It will always be vulnerable to my likes and dislikes, my personal preferences. And nothing that I discover there can ever be considered reliable. So at this point, you might think that, Krishnamurti would disagree and say, oh no, I'm sure you can look inwardly and be perfectly objective about it. Just go ahead and bear in mind that it's very important to be dispassionate and unbiased, and everything will be fine, you can do it. But no, Krishnamurti takes another approach entirely. Rather than rejecting the possibility that inward observation might not be objective, he embraces that possibility. In fact, he makes it central to his whole methodology. Krishnamurti says, watch what happens when you look at yourself. You will see that you're always judging what you observe, evaluating it as good or bad, and trying to shape your observations to conform to some preconceived standard. So discovering and learning about the way our personal preferences enter into and distort our observation is a critical, fundamental feature of Krishnamurti's methodology. But he doesn't just stop there and leave it at that, because the next step also reveals his originality. He says, if you see for yourself the fact, the reality, that your judgments are distorting your observation, then you may be able to look without that kind of interference. So we have to go slowly here because this is a crucial point. Let's say we're really serious about understanding ourselves, and we realize that requires that we observe ourselves and give attention to the inward flow of thoughts and feelings. But Krishnamurti warns us when we go down that path, we're going to see things in ourselves that we like and dislike. And he says every reaction of that kind, saying, this motivation is good or that feeling is bad, has the effect of distorting whatever we're trying to observe. So this is where Krishnamurti's originality comes into play, because he maintains it's possible to overcome or go beyond this tendency to evaluate whatever we observe inwardly. But that doesn't come about by resisting it or trying to do something about it. Instead, it comes about by sheer awareness. He says what is needed is simply to see for yourself the negative effects of those judgments, to see the absolute fact that it distorts clear perception. And that very awareness is the solvent in which those judgments may be dissolved and dissipate. So psychological change is not brought about by trying to do something. It doesn't come by exercising effort. Change is brought about by understanding, by seeing what is taking place. It's the actual understanding of what distorts observation that is itself the factor that eliminates those distortions. Now, Krishnamurti doesn't want you to just take his word for it. He doesn't want to function in the role of anyone's authority. So instead he says, try it out. Experiment. Learn for yourself how to observe without the interference of your sense of what is right or wrong, good or bad. And if you're able to go this far, then you will come to the place that Krishnamurti calls choiceless awareness. And when he uses the word choiceless, he means an awareness without condemnation or justification. That's how he describes the meaning of choiceless in this context. But it's not something you can do just by resolving to do it. You can't simply decide to stop condemnation or justification. It will only happen if you see for yourself the fact that it interferes with clear observation. Then and only then that kind of interference may drop away. So choiceless awareness is not a method. It's not a procedure that you can follow to bring about change. In other words, you cannot choose to engage in choiceless awareness. Instead, it's just a description of the state of mind that is necessary in order to see clearly. So it's something to understand, not an ideal intended for us to live up to. So, now we've described some of the essential elements of Krishnamurti's methodology. And, we could go into greater detail. There's really quite a bit more to be said, but I think this is enough for now. And so at this point, I'd like to switch gears again and consider how this interacts with or is woven into the rest of Krishnamurti's philosophy, because his teaching does not exist solely for the purpose of expressing this methodology, and yet at the same time it is essential to the teaching as a whole. So let's look now at the whole of Krishnamurti's philosophy and try to see what role the methodology plays in the big picture. So now let's try to state very, very briefly, very succinctly, what is the general content or subject matter of Krishnamurti's teaching? Or what is the overall theme or thesis for which the methodology exists? And we have to acknowledge that's a very difficult question to answer, because the first thing to point out is that Krishnamurti's teaching addresses the entire field of life, including all of consciousness and human relationship. But within that field of life and consciousness, he observes a great deal of conflict and disorder, which includes sorrow and grief and confusion and violence. And he also says, if you look closely, you will see that that same conflict and disorder exists within each one of us. And he says, what can we do about the disorder within ourselves? So what will bring order and intelligence into our own consciousness and relationship? And he says, order and intelligence will only come if you understand the nature of disorder. If you want to have order, you have to examine and understand disorder. And to really examine it directly, you have to see it as it functions within yourself. So this is where the methodology comes into play. Because if I myself am the source of conflict and disorder, or if I'm a participant in the general disorder, then what can I do about it? And Krishnamurti says, there's nothing you can do in any direct way. There is no method that will correct the disorder in human consciousness. The only thing you can do is to learn about it, to be aware of it, and to understand it. He says it's the very understanding of disorder that is the beginning of order. So, he says, learning about the disorder within yourself begins with the sheer observation of yourself in daily life. He says you watch your own behavior and all the circumstances of daily life, and you notice the thoughts and feelings that produce that behavior, which includes being aware of your own motivations and intentions and desires. And as you do this, Krishnamurti says, everything depends on how you watch. Can you observe yourself choicelessly? That is, without judging any of it as good or bad. Because only if you see yourself clearly, without distortion, will you begin to understand the disorder within yourself. So, Krishnamurti uses the words self-knowledge to describe this entire process. But what he means by self-knowledge really has quite a different quality than what he means by knowledge in general, or knowledge per se. Krishnamurti's often pointed out that knowledge per se is part of thought. He says it's the record or repository of the past, and he says the whole field of knowledge has characteristics that we don't always acknowledge or recognize. We tend to feel that knowledge is unlimited or potentially unlimited and can solve almost any problem. But Krishnamurti maintains that knowledge is always partial, limited, and it cannot solve the most important problems in life and relationship. But self-knowledge has a different quality or character in the way he uses those words than knowledge in general. Self-knowledge is more like self-awareness. It has to do with learning about yourself, but it's a kind of learning that does not get accumulated or stored up. It's an awareness or perception that's always in motion, because what you're observing, which is your own thoughts and feelings and intentions and actions, are themselves a process that is always in motion. So all of this that we've shared today is kind of a general introduction or orientation to Krishnamurti's methodology. And of course, what we've said is no substitute for seeing how he describes these issues himself. But Krishnamurti doesn't always give a lot of attention to these issues or go into it in a very systematic or comprehensive way. Instead, his comments about methodology tend to get woven into the fabric of his talks rather than taking center stage. But if you examine his teachings over the course of several decades, I think you'll see that in the earlier years, he used to give more attention to this. And by earlier years, I don't mean going all the way back to the 1920s or his theosophical days, but I'm talking about the period right after World War II into the 1950s, into the 1960s. And during those years, he tended to be more explicit about choiceless awareness and self-knowledge and the kinds of issues we've been talking about here. And I mention this partly because when he was more explicit about it, he often pointed out that choiceless awareness, or the process of self-knowledge, is not an easy or obvious thing to do. In fact, the word he used most often to describe this process is arduous. He said it was very difficult and a lot of hard work. It involves being aware of your thoughts and feelings all through the day on a daily basis. And you have to be very earnest and diligent, in his words, to do that. And I think it's important to point this out because in Krishnamurti's philosophy, an activity that is difficult and hard work is entirely different than what he calls effort. Krishnamurti objects to the exercise of effort. He insists there's no effort involved in awareness or self-knowledge, even though it is arduous. So to really understand him, I think we have to get clear about the difference between what he calls effort on one hand and hard work on the other hand. So the way to understand what Krishnamurti means by effort is to know that he associates effort with an act of will. And you exercise your will when you have to overcome some kind of resistance. You know, the exercise of will occurs when you make a decision to take a certain action. You formulate an idea and you tell yourself to obey that idea. That's the nature of will, and that's what Krishnamurti calls effort. So Krishnamurti maintains that you can never arrive at understanding or change through the exercise of your will. He says that is a form of division. It represents an inward conflict. One part of you is telling another part what to do, even though you may not really want to do it, but your will tells you that you must. So Krishnamurti considers this kind of thinking to be a prime example of disorder. It's the kind of thinking that his whole philosophy is designed, in part, to expose the falseness of. So self-knowledge, which is the clear, undistorted observation of yourself, does not come about through effort, which is an act of will. So it's another kind of action that is required. rather than effort, which is based on an idea, what is required is an action that is based on perception of what is, perception of facts. It's an action that your whole being, your whole brain and nervous system is involved in. You do it because all of you wants to do it. You would have to exercise effort in order to stop yourself from doing it. But that doesn't mean it is not hard work. It is very hard work. It's arduous. You have to be serious, earnest, to engage in it. So where does the energy come from to engage in all this hard work if I'm not exercising any form of effort? And the answer is it comes from observing the chaos and disorder of the world we live in. It is that perception of facts that gives you the energy to investigate, to discover, to find out what is the source of the violence and confusion and selfish, destructive behavior that is so widespread in human society. So I'd like to address just one more issue before we bring this talk to a close, and that is the issue of time. And you might feel like, time is kind of boring and mundane and maybe not very relevant to understanding consciousness or relationship. But Krishnamurti shows that time has important effects and unintended consequences that we often don't realize. Anyway, Krishnamurti says that time is not required to understand what he's talking about, which means to understand yourself. He's very emphatic about it. He says time is not required for psychological transformation. And he goes farther. He says if you do rely upon time as a means of change or understanding, then you will never understand or change. And I feel like this kind of statement is a little bit easy to misunderstand. It kind of sounds like he's saying, either you understand the whole thing right this minute or you will never get it. But I don't think that's what he's trying to say. When Krishnamurti talks about time, it's important to recall his distinction between ordinary chronological time and psychological time. We discussed this a little bit earlier. If I form an image of what I am now and another image of what I want to become, it's overcoming that gap, that distance, that Krishnamurti calls psychological time. And he maintains that this kind of time is illusory because those two images don't really correspond to anything actual. Each image represents kind of a fixed point. And in the psychological field, there are no fixed points, because everything is always in motion. So the whole program of improving myself through psychological time rests on a false premise, a false understanding of what I actually am. So it's thinking in terms of psychological time that is the impediment to understanding oneself. So I don't think Krishnamurti is saying that chronological time is any kind of problem or obstacle for choiceless awareness or self-knowledge. He says self-knowledge is hard work, and that means work that takes place through chronological time. Sometimes he even says, take time to study these matters, to examine them every day. So I think it's helpful to remember this distinction, because sometimes Krishnamurti just uses the word time by itself without making clear that he's really talking just about psychological time. So, as we said at the beginning, Krishnamurti's philosophy is highly original. It cannot be placed into any category or tradition or existing school of thought. And his methodology is also original. And I think the central issue in his methodology is the discovery of what is the true nature of psychological change. So he says fundamental psychological change does not come about as a result of my deliberate intention to do something to change myself. That's the way change works outwardly in the physical world, but not in the psychological world. Inwardly, change occurs as a result of seeing, awareness, understanding, insight. Or rather, it's not so much that understanding brings about change, but rather insight, understanding, is itself the transformation of consciousness. And I think that is the key principle of Krishnamurti's methodology. So I think we're going to have some questions and answers. Francisco, the other Francisco, are we going to do that now? I think, Francisco, are you guys going to take charge?
We have a few questions that we would like to ask you, and then we're going to take questions from the audience here, and then questions from the online audience. So if you can wait a little bit. Well, one thing that came to me, thank you, first of all, for the presentation. One aspect that it seems to me keeps coming back is this idea of the distinction between our psychology and our biology. And on one hand, it seems that our psychology has its own nature, as it were. It deals with symbolic representation and mental narratives, and which seems different than our biology. But when you think about the way we deal with, for example, let's say you are in some kind of panic mode, and one of the things that's important to do, let's say, is to maybe breathe deeply in order to then be able to stop your running thoughts. The nervous system, if it's not regulating itself properly, that's a sign maybe of a trauma, right? Like you are not able to really, calm yourself, and it's always, going to a particular mental scenario. So I was thinking, so you have that experience. You also have what when Krishnamurti mentions how to observe an emotion, really. And it looks to me that he in that observation, he says that you go beyond the word and you don't get caught in the narrative, in your mental story of the emotion, is as if you're able to observe your biology, almost like the visceral experience of the emotion. So at that level, it started looking to me that the difference between our psychology and our biology is either non-existent or very thin. Let's say. I just wanted to see what you thought of that.
Wow, that's such an interesting question. It's very profound. People could write books on that. Just a couple things which come to mind. Take the issue of fear, which, Krishnamurti discusses at such length, and Krishnamurti maintains that it's possible to live without fear. But when he talks about that, he's talking about psychological fears. And he acknowledges that there's such a thing as what most people think of as biological fears, but he doesn't call them fears. If you see a rattlesnake in your path, your whole nervous system reacts. But he refuses to call that fear. Mm-hmm. He says that's the intelligence of the body.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So fear, he says, something psychological. And he acknowledges that we have the animal within us. I remember one time he said, we don't have tails, but we behave like monkeys. So, so therefore there's, biologically there's instinct, and, some of that instinct is no doubt aggressive impulses, right? Mm-hmm. There's parts of our nervous system which take pleasure in aggression. It's a fact. So Krishnamurti, I think, is interested in cultivating a kind of intelligence that can see that and not resist it by judging it or putting it down, but see it for what it is and act in a way which is more intelligent than that instinct. You pointed out that, to observe an emotional reaction without memory, without labeling it, which is such a key part of the teachings, brings us more into contact with the actual physiology of what's going on. No doubt true. We're not having that screen of words and memories interfering. And for sure, that's part of being more in tune with what is, right? The biology at that point, the physiology is what is.
Yeah.
And so that interacts with it. But it's such a complicated question that my mind spins in a number of directions. I'll just mention one more since you bring in biology. Biology has a lot to do with evolution. In the dialogues that Krishnamurti had with David Bohm, the ones that are published as The Ending of Time, right near the beginning of that, Krishnamurti says, has humanity taken a wrong turn? And when they go into it, I don't think they use the words evolution necessarily, but it's implicit that they're talking about over the course of hundreds of thousands of years, was there a point in the development of humanity that Krishnamurti calls a wrong turn, which means confusion, inward conflict, and it seems clear, not just from the dialogue between Krishnamurti and Bohm, but from many other indications that humanity has taken a kind of wrong turn, because we have this extraordinary capacity of thought, language, memory, which has produced so much. Everything in this room, and yet, as it functions within us, we don't understand it fully, and it has terrible consequences that we have not learned to understand or live with, which is, I think, what his teachings are all about. So that brings in biology in a different way. It's a very rich question, could take it in many directions.
Thank you.
Hello? Okay, I wrote mine down because I don't think I'd remember it. Do you think a method at some point, like at the beginning of someone's journey to understand themselves or look at themselves, is useful or necessary? So like if someone is at the very beginning of all of this, like how would they even go about becoming aware of that in the first place without a method, especially if that's all they know?
I don't know the answer to that. Krishnamurti says the key thing is listening. He wants people to listen to what he's saying without bringing in their background, their past, their judgments. Everything that I said today about methods, or everything Krishnamurti says about methods, it doesn't mean that methods are bad. It doesn't mean, it's not thou shalt not engage in a method. The point is to understand what a method is and to see for yourself the limitations of it. And if you want to try a method for meditation or anything else, go ahead. But see what you're doing. See the implications of it. And, how do you begin? You begin with the simplest things. I'm trying to think of the book, I think it's the book, The Only Revolution. In one of the very, very early chapters of that, somebody who's questioning Krishnamurti says, tell me about awareness. And he just breaks it down to the very, very simplest thing. You look at a tree, and you're aware of it, and then you name the tree. You recognize it, which brings in another element. So you start with the simplest things. You start with the simplest observation of yourself and the manner in which you live your life. The actual problems that you have. You stop. You question. What is the source of that? You don't just react to it. You look at it. Find out the source of it. Krishnamurti says, the problem with problems, I'm not quoting him, this is my way of putting it, the problem with problems is that we want to solve them. He says, a correct approach to a problem is not to look for a resolution, is to understand it. If you will understand the problem, then something can happen. I don't know if that helps. That's the best I can do.
Thanks, David. So it looks like we have some questions from the audience, and then I think we'll take those for 10 minutes and then spend the last 5 for online questions.
Hi.
Thank you for your excellent presentation. My question is this. Krishnamurti talks about images and the issue of time, which you just described a few minutes ago. In all of that, the way I understood it, that science is seen as something where experiments and observations were made first, and then the theories were put in later. But now you have a whole field of science, like the theory of relativity of Einstein, Well, the whole theory came first, and then the experiments later proved them. For example, they have a model of atom and a model of molecule. They did not have microscopes at the time when they came out with the model. So does this in any way invalidate what Kay has to say about images and psychological time and all that? That's my question.
Well, let me approach it in a slightly different way, if I may, and just address the question of theories.
Okay.
Theories in science.
Yes.
And I know how to answer this because I have an idea how to answer it, because there's a passage in, the dialogues between Krishnamurti and Bohm. It's rather interesting because, they go into some very, very subtle and profound issues. But then later on they circle around and they start talking about theories. And Krishnamurti says that it's possible to live without theories. And he considers that to be a rather obvious and elementary thing, and not nearly as subtle and profound as some of the other things that they've been discussing and agreeing about. In fact, he calls it a schoolboy issue.
I see.
But the interesting thing is that on this schoolboy issue, that's the one that Bohm disagrees with them about. And
I see.
They have a whole exchange about it. And Bohm says, look, in science, he says, you have to have theories. He says, you can't do science without theories. He says, you need a theory in order to, I can't remember the words that he used, but my impression is you need a theory in order to see how the facts relate to one another and to make the whole thing coherent. And at first, Krishnamurti kind of hesitates, and you can see he doesn't want to agree with it, but he's talking to Bohm, who's the scientist. So finally, Krishnamurti says, okay, he says, in science, he says, maybe so. He says, I wouldn't know. But he says in the psychological field, he insists there's no need for theories.
I see. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Really wonderful, delightful. I just wish I was there in these last few decades, relishing in that process of transformation while this was happening and being conceived. But I just wanted to just see if there's a way in which we can ask ourselves that question or try to figure out what was that process of how there's no time issue involved. If you're bringing time in there, then that's something, and I'm just asking the question not just for David, but also for all of us, is I'm the father of an 8-year-old daughter, and she is living in a timeless state of being.
Yeah.
Absolute bliss. And somewhere along the way, when we are growing up into adults, we are creating some things that hold us back, that take us into that wrong turn, I suppose, making lots of wrong turns. And I'm just wondering, it's almost like, hey, in this moment, we have to be able to get into that state of being where there's thoughts are just like and ceasing, in order for us to be able to actually live fully. And in that, like when a big ball is rolling down, there's only one point where that ball is touching the ground. So as we are existing, as we are moving in life, if we are fully occupying that moment, then perhaps, and we are observant of that, then perhaps that's all that matters. And so I'm just wondering, it's important to sort of be aware of that Zen moment, or at least be in that state. So I just wanted to bring it up because that's what I kind of took from the discussion. So thank you. Any thoughts?
Yeah, that's very interesting, very well said. You know, it makes us ask, how can I get into that state? Like your 8-year-old daughter, right? So then, we're looking for a method, right? That's the way our minds work, right? How can I do that? How? So it becomes not so much a matter of how can I get into that as to see that I'm not in that, and to see that what I'm doing that is not that. And it's that perception that maybe makes that other thing. That's why he calls it the negative approach. If you can see the falseness, then the falseness may drop away.
Okay, David, so I've got some questions from the online audience. Thanks, guys, for sending your questions in. The first one we have here is, please touch upon choiceless awareness, for surely this is key. So I think they're asking for some clarification on choiceless awareness.
Right. Okay, choiceless awareness, yes. As I mentioned, it's something that Krishnamurti spoke more about in some of the earlier years. If you find transcripts of talks from right after World War II and into the 1950s, 1960s. So this is an awareness of oneself. As he puts it, without condemnation or justification. That means without evaluating what you see in yourself. And if you start to give attention to this, what happens is you can't jump into choiceless awareness. As I said, you can't choose to engage in choiceless awareness. You can try to, but then you will see, if you're trying to do it, then you'll see that you're evaluating whether or not you're doing it properly, which is not doing it. It's evaluating, right? And so the key then is, if you're interested in this, what's going to happen is you're going to discover that your awareness is not choiceless. That's the first step, is to discover that you are subtly, implicitly judging yourself. You're doing it all the time, even if you don't know about Krishnamurti or choiceless awareness. It's a thing that we do within ourselves. And so then, can you become aware of that process of judgment? That's the thing. You don't jump to choiceless awareness. You begin to learn about the fact that you are judging yourself. Little things, quickly, subtly. It happens. It just enters in like a little feeling that you have about some thought you had, or some action, or some memory of something you did. Or sometimes it's very subtle, sometimes it's strong, right? And almost overwhelming. But you do this to yourself a lot, whether you're aware of it or not. So the first thing is just to become aware of that you're doing it. And then to just raise within yourself the possibility, is it possible to watch myself the way I would watch, suppose I was a scientist and watching single-celled organisms under a microscope and fascinated by their behavior. I wouldn't judge their behavior. I would just want to see, what is it? What are they doing? Can I watch myself with that same objectivity? And you find very quickly you can't. And then you ask yourself, why? Why can't I? And maybe I could see things more clearly if all of that could just be put aside.
Well, I wanted to clarify something, if you don't mind, and it can be briefly, because in a way you caused quite a stir online on the online audience with the title of your of course, with the title of your talk.
Methodology. Oh.
So I just wanted to see if you thought, and you mentioned this before, but if you actually thought that there was a method in the teachings, even though Krishnamurti would specifically say there is no method to get there, but you actually think that there is somehow some kind of procedure in the way he talks about these things.
Well, that's what I tried to explain. I knew that using the word methodology, if you don't know what I'm talking about, it's going to sound like, hey, Krishnamurti doesn't have any methods. How could you talk about methodology? So I'm using the word, as I tried to explain, in a broader, looser sense to encompass, okay, if you don't have a method, why don't you have a method? That's what methodology is. Even in science, if I have a method, the method per se is not really the methodology. The methodology is my explanation as to the reasons why I chose that method to apply to this particular research question. So I'm using the word methodology to refer, right, Krishnamurti doesn't have a method, but he has got reasons why he doesn't have a method. And it's those reasons which are what I'm calling his methodology.
Very good. Yeah, that's it. That's a good clarification. Thank you.
Okay.
All right, so I think we have time for one last question. Okay, this person is asking if you can elaborate on what place dialogue has in Krishnamurti's methodology.
Right, dialogue. That's another such a huge question. During the years when Krishnamurti was here and engaging with all of us, that term dialogue didn't come up so often. In the meetings that he conducted, we thought more in terms of inquiry. We're engaging in conversations in order to inquire, in order to learn. But Bohm came along, and Bohm's work, flowed into Krishnamurti's work, and then, Bohm was alive for a few years after Krishnamurti died, and Bohm was very, very interested in dialogue. He thought it was hugely important. And all kinds of dialogue groups and principles and procedures of what is called Bohm dialogue developed out of that. And that created like a stream of effects, and since it was right parallel to the Krishnamurti world kind of got into that stream too. So now the Krishnamurti world is also doing Bohm dialogue. Not that there's any tremendously big difference between the K world and the Bohm world, but Krishnamurti didn't exactly do what you would call dialogue per se, although that's what he was doing. He didn't call it that. He would have meetings in which the stated aim was more like what he would call inquiry, and questions would be raised. And what would happen in that meeting was very similar to a dialogue, because there would be a room full of people, and it was free and open, and in principle anybody could speak up at almost any time and say what they wanted, and the thing was open-ended. It could go in whatever direction depending on where the question took us. But just because it was in principle open for anybody to say anything at any time, it doesn't mean that everybody did. On contrary, most of the people most of the time were a little bit intimidated, because Krishnamurti's presence was so strong, not just on his reputation, but just by virtue of his clarity and the strength of his responses. So it had many of the features of dialogue, but the whole idea of dialogue was really developed more by David Bohm, what's called Bohmian dialogue, which is used in all kinds of settings, business and institutions. And it kind of took a different track. I'm not quite answering the question, because I think what the questioner wants to know is there a place for dialogue in learning about, understanding Krishnamurti's work? And I'd say, sure, there is. But, okay, I'll just leave it at that. Yeah, there's a place for dialogue, definitely.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay.